want to know why I'm here? I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here so that my son doesn't grow up to feel as bad about me as I do about my dad.
Today we are having a fascinating conversation with Dr. Ronald Levant. He is a trailblazer in the psychology of men and masculinities, a professor emeritus, former head of the APA Division of Men and Masculinities.
How many of you know a man who can't tell you what he's feeling? And every hand goes up. The most effective means known to humans for managing stress, ranging from minor hassles to major traumas, is what? It's talking about your stress with another trusted person. And if you can't put your stress into words, if you can't describe what you're feeling, you're severely handicapped.
We will explore powerful topics like the men's emotional gaps, tense father-son bonds, and the concept of normative male alexithymia.
We have to put aside John Wayne and the stereotypical masculinity and rethink that the idea that all things feminine are bad. Recognize that you're entering into a world where emotional intelligence is going to be very, very important. Men who feel their masculinity has been threatened are more likely to resort to violence, including gun violence.
We'll also examine the connection between threatened masculinity and rising violence, including mass shootings, and discuss actionable solutions.
We have to change the way we raise our boys. We have to re-socialize young men. We have to provide emotional education. We need to help men develop a vocabulary for emotions.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin.
Hello, and welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and you're here with part 2 of the Dr. Ronald Levant podcast. We were talking about a ton of stuff. I was really honored to be able to interview you on the past episode. You're a professor emeritus at the University of Akron. You've run the APA Division of Men and Masculinities. You've published an unbelievable amount of work on masculinities from both a feminist model as well as a modern psychological model and a strength-based model. So it's really an honor just to get 2 hours of your time on the show today. And we're going to pick up kind of where we left off, talking about fatherhood, diving into a little bit of gun violence, and hopefully getting some of your thoughts on what men need today. So Dr. Levant, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed our conversation, and listeners, you can just go back. I think it's going to be the last week, so you can go back and listen to it if you want to catch up to hear more about his story, how he got into the work, and some of the early work he did around men and masculinity. Also, a cool story about a psychedelic trip, which you don't hear as often. So maybe we can dive into that too. But Dr. Levant, I just want to pick up where we left off, which is around fatherhood. And you were doing some really seminal work on fatherhood in the 80s, where you were employing, cameras to see men's affect. You were talking about the importance of positive male mentors. And I just want to pick up there of, what are some of the takeaways that you saw from that work that you did on fatherhood?
Yeah, I guess, a couple I'll mention. One was that so many men, myself included, had really horrible fathers. And these were men that were largely baby boomer men. I'm not sure if that's changed, more millennial men, but I'll give you an example. There was typically, the fatherhood course that I ran at Boston University. The first meeting in the class, it would be kind of introductions, and I would ask the men, why they joined this class. And one particular class, I noticed that one of the fathers typically, get, some 8 to 12 men ranging from 30s to 50s, and children ranging from toddlers to, young adults. And I noticed one guy was particularly tense. So I asked him if he had anything on his mind. And he said, with his lips pursed, he says, "You want to know why I'm here? I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here so that my son doesn't grow up to feel as bad about me as I do about my dad.
Yeah. Powerful.
Yeah, very powerful. I mean, his words hit the room like a hurricane. And opened up every man. And I can't remember exactly how many men were in the group at that time, but every man had a story about having a very difficult relationship with a difficult father. And again, these are boomer men primarily, so things may have changed. But I certainly, in my recent memoir called The Problem with Men, discussed, my brutalizing father, who physically and emotionally abused me from the age of 2, though I'd have no recollection of that's from the report of an uncle. But so that's one thing that, and I hope that has changed. But so many men that I was working with at the time and even later, talked about having a really demanding, sometimes brutal, often abusive fathers. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I do. I mean, I think the current, wisdom is a lot of that's like trauma, right, from the Second World War. I'm Jewish, and I have Holocaust survivors in my family, and there's Holocaust survivors in many people that I know, and it seems like that trickled down a lot into our families, right? A lot of abuse and emotional abuse and undercutting, or just men that were just dead and cut off to the world, that were just kind of broken in many ways, or alcoholic or whatever. I think you mentioned the generational difference, and I was trying to bring it up, but I think it's a good segue is, let me walk this back. I see with the boomers, right? A lot of their masculinity was anti-feminine, right? Which is what some people label as toxic masculinity now. It was a defense against femininity, right? Anything feminine is not masculine, and that's it, right? But with my generation, the millennials, it's like anti-boomer, right? So like anti, tough guy, anti kind of like, domineering, what we see as domineering, right? Anti like aggressive. And a lot of my generation are nice guys. I don't know if you read some of the work of Dr. Glover. We actually had him on the show a little bit earlier, but a lot of them are nice guys where they're kind of like, passive, people pleasing. And I was like this too, right? We were pushing away from the boomer generation. So I think our issues are a little different than what the boomer generation was working through,
Well, but you still had difficult relationships with your fathers.
Yes. I think a lot of it is like the millennials were born with higher emotional needs because the boomers did provide for our physical needs, right? Which is amazing. So we went like one rung up the Maslow's hierarchy, right? So now we have emotional needs. And I think our fathers weren't prepared for that, right? Because they were focused a lot more on, finances and logistics and building safety and security in the home, not so much having like emotional moments with their children.
Yeah. Anyway, that was one takeaway from the Fatherhood Project. Another takeaway was the one we started talking about last time, which is men's emotional inexpressiveness.
Yep.
And we haven't done any. There's a clinical term for this, alexithymia. This word was coined in the 60s. By a group of psychiatrists and psychologists who are studying psychosomatic patients. These are patients who have physical symptoms but without any organic cause or medical cause. And it's subsequently, the term migrated to other disorders, eating disorders, PTSD. And from my work in the Fatherhood Project and with the man that I described in the last episode, who, had a lot of difficulty explaining how he felt about his son standing him up for a father-son hockey game, I did some research and came up with the idea that, based on the research, that boys are more emotionally expressive than girls until about between the ages of 4 and 6. And that they tend to lose their emotional expressivity, and they have an increased. So these are boys who are reared to conform to the masculine norm of restrictive emotionalities. That's one of the norms you mentioned, avoid all things feminine. Another one is restrict the expression of emotions, except for anger. That's cool. But the rest of it, nah, that's girly stuff.
Yep.
So, well, I took the term alexithymia and kind of put it into a different context, and I termed what I was looking at normative male alexithymia. That is, it affected men more often than women, and it was based on masculine norms. That's why some people thought I meant normative as infrequent. Not necessarily. Like I said, there were no prevalence studies of alexithymia done in the USA, but there was one done in Finland, and 17% of men met criteria for alexithymia. Now, when I say met criteria, there is a way to do that. There's a particular scale that has cutoffs. It's called the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, and the authors had developed their cutoffs based on clinical interviews with patients. So it's not the 100% best, but it's better than most. And so using those criteria, as I said, they found 17% of men and then 10% of women met criteria for alexithymia. Though no studies have been done in the U.S., whenever I do an in-person seminar or group, I always ask the audience, how many of you know a man who can't tell you what he's feeling? And every hand goes up. Yeah, so it's fairly common. How common, who knows? And also, I'm talking about a milder version. The clinical alexithymia includes 3 components: difficulty identifying feeling, difficulty describing feeling, and something called externally oriented thinking. My normative male just has the difficulty identifying and difficulty describing feelings, and it doesn't go quite as far and probably doesn't represent quite as much damage as clinical alexithymia. So I went about developing my own scale, the normative male alexithymia scale, which I subsequently updated and shortened using better technique, structural equation modeling, item response theory. And so that's the normative male alexithymia brief form. But the real work was done in the 90s when I was at Harvard Medical School part-time and had a nearly full-time practice that I focused on men. I was very interested in trying to see what could be done to engage men, to better engage men in psychotherapy. So this will probably be a term that your readers or your audience hasn't heard of, but I advertise in the yellow pages. You probably don't even know what that is.
I know what that is. I had a phone book. I get it. Now it's just Google, but yes.
Yeah, now it's just Google, but I advertised in the yellow pages with a big ad, and it said counseling for men.
Cool.
And I told my colleagues at Harvard Medical School, send me the men that your women clients complain about.
That's my whole marketing strategy. We're doing the same thing. We're doing the same business model. Yeah.
So I got a practice full of men who at the very least had problems with relationships. Many were alexithymic. And I tried to figure out ways to help them be able to put their emotions into words. And you might ask, why was I doing this? Well, being able to, not being able to verbalize your emotions really handicaps people who are alexithymic in several ways. In relationships, every relationship except the most superficial requires some level of disclosure of vulnerability and inner feelings and things of that nature. Close friends, romantic partners, relatives. The other thing is that the most effective means known to humans for managing stress, ranging from minor hassles to major traumas, is what? It's talking about your stress with another trusted person. And if you can't put your stress into words, if you can't describe what you're feeling, you're severely handicapped, and so that becomes a problem. And also, every model of psychotherapy, even the most behavioral models, require that the patient access their emotions to some degree. For example, in exposure therapy, the patient has to be able to discern subtle differences in their anxiety levels in response to different threatening stimuli, right? Mm-hmm. So I figure if we could help men who are in therapy identify and describe their emotions, they might get a higher uptake from psychotherapy, more benefit. Oh. So the first thing I noticed, and I was also doing groups as well as individual and some couples therapy at the time. Yeah. But in groups, one of the things I would do is I would ask, and I had a flip chart. This is before whiteboards and all that stuff. And I'd ask men to name words for emotions, and I'd write them up on the flip chart. And with a group of maybe 6 to 8 men, I might get 30 words. 20 were words reflecting anger in some way.
Yep.
Pissed off.
Sure.
Irritated, annoyed, enraged. It goes on. And then about 8 were not emotions at all, but symptoms of stress. Burdened, zapped, depleted, burnt out. And then maybe 1 or 2 were actual emotion words like joy or fear. So the first thought I had was that we need to help men develop a vocabulary for emotions. Because if they're going to be able to identify their emotions, they need to have words to use them. So I would, in my sessions, I would ask the guy, my client, to write down as a homework assignment as many words for emotion as they can during the week and bring it back to the next session. And then I would kind of throw in a little sly dig. Say, the guy I saw earlier today brought in 30 words.
How about that? Leverage by competition. Yeah.
Yeah. I know my guy's going to come in with 31 words.
Exactly. At least, yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you a quick question about the emotionality. And because you mentioned psychosomatic, right? And like somatic psychotherapy, somatic experiencing is like a newer thing, right? So I wonder, how do I put this into words? Like some of the guys I work with, right, when they talk about their emotions, it's very external, right? They're saying like, oh, somebody in this experience would feel sad, right? Or would feel angry, right? And I think it's another level to actually like go into the body and to feel the sensations of emotions,
I'm getting there.
Okay, you're getting there. Yeah. Because I'm curious about the difference between those two ways of emotional expression.
Well, I'm going to get to that point, and I'm aware of the point you're making, and it's a valid one. But I'm just going through the steps that I came up with. So one, learning words for emotions. Mm-hmm. Before we get to the step of identifying your own emotions, I thought it would be easier to help men identify emotions in other people.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we're on the same page. Yep.
Yeah. So I taught, I would teach them a little bit about, nonverbal communication, facial expressions, tone of voice, paralinguistic things like sighs, cries, and gasps, body language. And then I would ask them during the course of the week between now and the next time we see each other, when you're talking with someone or even while you're watching, television, ask yourself and try to read the person's face and their tone of voice. Ask yourself, what is that person feeling while they're saying this? So they got the words now. Now I'm asking them to apply it to something less threatening than themselves, to somebody else. It could be someone they don't even know, a personality on television. And that usually takes, a week or two. The first exercise usually about a week. And by the way, these exercises, the instructions take no more than 10 minutes in session. So whatever you're working on in therapy, you can continue, and then you give out the homework assignment. So they do a lot of the work on their own. And then we come to the tough part, identifying your own emotions, Now, I've had clients who really did not feel an emotion when something had one. They felt like a bodily sensation, like butterflies in my chest, or a tight band across my forehead, or tension in my neck, or feeling like my legs want to run away from me. they'll describe these bodily sensations. So here's what I did. I said, we're going to keep an emotional response log. It could be some 3x5 cards you stick in your shirt pocket, right? And when you're feeling either an emotion or a bodily sensation you think might be an emotion, write it down. Describe what you're experiencing. Then ask yourself, who is doing what to whom and how does that affect me? And then with that, go back through your vocabulary list and pick out the word or words that describe what you might be feeling. So here's an example. I was expecting feedback on my progress report from my supervisor at noon, and here it is 12:45, and I haven't heard from him. Okay. What is the bodily sensation? Well, kind of butterflies in my stomach. Okay. What word or words might describe how you're feeling in light of the fact that you were expecting this report and it has occurred? Okay, apprehensive, anxious. So you see how it's very mechanical. I often, not in the past, in the past I've described it as kind of emotional kindergarten. And that's appropriate because for a lot of these men, they're learning about emotional expression was interrupted when they were children. Maybe not kindergarten, but first grade, second grade, something like that. So that was kind of the plan, and I started working with guys doing this, and later on I manualized it because that was the thing in therapy. You want manualized treatments. And then I actually did a clinical trial of it, and tried for 5 years to get a randomized clinical trial going at the Veterans Administration, but was not able to. So that's kind of the program. We call it alexithymia reduction treatment. The clinical trial compared a group of men who underwent ART with another group of men who had treatment as usual. And the experimental group showed a reduction in alexithymia, reduction in certain masculine norms, and the other group showed no change. So at least we shows, at least a minimal demonstration of efficacy.
That's great.
So that was the approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I got tons of questions to ask. I think, the first one, building on what I say, I find like a lot of guys, when I ask them to feel, right, to go in and like feel sensations, they can't feel really below their neck. They can feel like maybe a tightness in their throat. They can feel maybe like a headache or something. But I find a lot of guys are really cut off from, their chest, from their, stomach, from their gut in a lot of ways. I think they're very cerebral. I'm curious if you notice that, or if you see that as a trend of like really getting guys to feel lower, I guess for lack of a better term, to become more embodied.
That wasn't my experience, Mark. I mean, I had guys like, they talked about butterflies in their stomach or butterflies in their chest, I guess it was, or, tight band across their forehead. That would be above the neck. I didn't notice that particular thing. I just noticed that they could, some of them could only describe their feelings in bodily terms, but I didn't notice specifically above the neck or below the neck.
Okay. Yeah. Because I find a lot of guys carry a lot of tension. So when they try to feel deeper, it's like kind of what you're saying. They feel more stress and less feeling, Another question I have for you is, kind of moving up a generation. Maybe you've worked with younger generation, maybe not. So let me know. But, I find like, again, a lot of my millennial generation, and even younger too, Gen Z, like we have a lot of emotional language because many of us were raised by moms, right? We're kind of the generation of divorce.
Yeah.
So we were raised by a lot of women. So we can talk with women. I think we're actually a lot better at being kind of having those emotional feminine conversations, right? But still we're not feeling anything. Like we're kind of like putting up a mask and engaging in these conversations where we can talk about, group dynamics or social hierarchies or kind of like gossip and drama, right? I think we were way more capable of that than the older generations. But again, there's not like a feeling. I think a lot of guys are still disconnected and cut off from their own experience. I guess do you see that? Do you have any ideas about that? Is that a trend that you're noticing?
Well, I would, I don't have the same kind of clinical experience or practice that you have, but if I were seeing men like that,
Yeah.
I would essentially do what I've done with the other guys, which is kind of give them the scale. You can give it right in session. It takes 5 minutes to fill out, another 5 minutes to score, and then you kind of know what you're dealing with. And if they scored in my scale, I don't have clinical cutoffs, but what I do is I use as a proxy is the mean plus one standard deviation. So I've got the cutoffs clear, so I can quickly calculate that. And if the guy is one, or in some cases even two standard deviations above the mean, I know I'm dealing with alexithymia. And then I'll do some psychoeducation.
What they?
Kind of say, well, I think you probably were raised with the idea that, boys don't cry and boys don't show emotions and things of that nature. And as a result, as an adult, you seem to have a difficulty in identifying and describing your own emotions. And I think some of the problems that you talked about, like I usually connected to why they came into therapy. Like in one guy in particular, he came into therapy because, his wife was pregnant and she was concerned that he didn't feel anything about his impending fatherhood. I would, your wife, you came here because your wife asked you to, because you weren't feeling anything. Well, I think this approach may enable you to access your emotions and put them into words, and would improve your relationships with your wife. So I'll tie it to their presenting problem, and I'll sell it. Basically, it's a sales pitch. I'm selling them this is what I suggest we do over the next 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how fast we progress, and let's see how it goes and see if it works for you. And so that's kind of what I do. And then I'll start off just like I said. I don't kind of approach it the same way you do, but I think any clinician kind of develops their own way of approaching clients, and so.
Yeah, I like that. I think a lot of guys need that pitch now. I'm sure you're familiar with kind of Surgeon General's warning about the loneliness epidemic that is impacting our society, and I think specifically men. And I think for me, that's kind of the pitch that I give to my dudes is like, yeah, you feel alone because you're not feeling anything. I think a lot of men are very disconnected, and we've done it for good reason to not feel the bad emotions. But in that, we also lose the good emotions, things you mentioned, like joy, connection, celebration, things like that. So I think a lot of guys, like we talked about that story of a dad who doesn't feel anything. That's really common, right? I think we're feeling very disconnected from our world in general, and therefore life can feel really gray. And I think a lot of men are in a depressive kind of neutral state, and that's a lonely place to be,
No, I think younger men, and it was apparent their disaffection, in the recent election when they turned out in large numbers for the Republican nominee. Here's my take on it, and I have to do a little social history, but go back to the 50s, and when traditional gender roles were the norm. Women couldn't get credit cards. Very few mothers worked, like less single-digit percentages of mothers of children under 6 were in the workforce. And divorce was relatively uncommon. But starting actually in the 1950s, women started entering the workforce in droves. And by 1985, from 1955 to 1985, the percentage of women in the workforce increased exponentially to the point that mothers of small children went from single digits to 50% in the workforce.
Wow.
Dramatic social change.
Yeah.
What happened next? From 1965 to 1985 was what was called the divorce revolution, where it went to the point, and like you spoke of being raised in a single parent home. Maybe that was due to divorce, I don't know. But many young adults were raised in single parent homes, largely due to the divorce revolution. And a little known fact, Mark, is that 2/3 of those divorces were initiated by the wives.
I didn't know that, but I believe it. Yeah, it's an empowerment thing, right? Yeah.
Right. Well, once they gained financial independence,
Yeah.
they started leaving bad marriages in droves.
Right.
And this was part of what we call second wave feminism that began around 1967 with the publication of the Feminine Mystique and Ms. Magazine and Gloria Steinem, and it transformed women's place in society to the point that now, in colleges and universities, women far exceed men in admissions, in completions, in attendance in graduate and professional schools, medical school, law school, business school, and men are kind of. While all this mentoring happened for young girls, nothing like that happened for the boys. That is the problem. Nothing like that happened for the boys that said, okay, the world is changing. We have to put aside John Wayne and the stereotypical masculinity and rethink that the idea that all things feminine are bad, and recognize that you're entering into a world where emotional intelligence is going to be very, very important.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show.
So boys, essentially, and I have data from a chapter that I published in 2009. No, I published it 2021, but it was from research that was published in 2019 that shows that boys are still raised the way I was raised in the 1940s and 1950s, to conform to masculine norms of being tough, dominant, avoid all things feminine, restrict the expression of emotions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the problem. We have to change the way we raise our boys. We have to re-socialize young men. We have to provide emotional education. We're in a situation now where we've got a crisis of connection between the genders that's vast. Young men are not dating. They're just not. I saw a videotape of kind of describing this phenomenon, and it was kind of young men talking, and one talked about the last date I went on, it felt like a job interview, and another guy said something equally discouraging. So Mark, men and women are out of sync today, and that's the problem. Women, the latest thing as a result of the election and the clear misogyny built into the victory is American women are thinking of taking up a movement in South Korea called the 4Bs movement. Have you heard about that?
I haven't heard about that, no. Educate me.
Okay. Well, the word bis, B-I-S in Korean means not.
Okay.
So it's not dating men, not having sex with men, not marrying men, not having babies with men, the 4Bs.
Okay.
So women are starting to say, I'm not sure I want anything to do with men. Maybe I'm going to be kind of an existential lesbian or something. It's just, men's, to put it bluntly, a lot of women think men suck.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, like misandry, right? There's like a lot of that out there and disconnection. And, I'm probably more on your side where I think men are being held to a higher standard, right? And specifically like an emotional standard that where that level of like privilege that we've had of like just being like, okay, we have the money, so we make the rules is going away. And now we need to be more connected. We have to be more vulnerable. If we want to date, if we want to be parents, if we want to move forward in society, like the skills are different.
And normal developmental things that people expect of us. Exactly.
Like physical strength and of fat pocketbook isn't going to be enough anymore. You know?
No, emotional intelligence is key.
Yeah.
And, changing. The other thing is, I mean, so much of boyhood socialization, I know it was the case when I grew up, it involves disparaging girls.
What's that?
So there's a certain amount of misogyny that was built into my socialization. We thought girls had cooties. I think that was the word.
Yeah, I mean, me too, right? I mean, it was anti-women, and in my generation, it was also very anti-gay, right? There was a lot of that homophobia going around.
Mine too. Yeah.
But I think we talked a little bit on the previous show where it's like, I think that's a very fragile position for masculinity to be in, that it's an anti-personality, right? It's anti-gay, it's anti-women. Whereas I know some of your work, and I want to ask you about that, is about like, okay, what's masculinity if it's not anti-something, right? What's a positive form of masculinity? What's it implicit, inherent, or a more robust or resilient form of masculinity? Because, my experience is it's always been like, oh, we're just not that. We don't really know what we are, but we're not that, Which is,
we're a bunch of
I think it's just structurally weak,
Yeah. No, I'm not sure, that I would call it positive masculinity. I would probably call it positive psychology applied to men.
Great.
But, there's a whole branch of psychology that kind of got started in the last 20 years of focusing not so much on deficits, but on positive assets and resilience, grit, emotional intelligence. A lot of these things are psychological skills that boys boys learn grit and resilience. I'll say that when I grew up, that was clear, but we didn't learn empathy. We didn't learn compassion. We didn't learn how to express our own emotions. The girls that I knew back when I was a boy they would play by having conversations. And they would learn a lot of emotional skills. They, like I said, they would learn to communicate their emotions. They would learn to express empathy with another girl's emotions. They would, when a girl was hurting, they'd learn to express compassion. But even most important, they learned to resolve differences through conversation.
Yep.
What I learned is the only way to resolve differences was through fists.
Yeah.
I grew up in a working-class neighborhood, and of course, it's probably more common there than more of a middle-class neighborhood or upper middle class or whatever. But most of I would say, probably almost all of the fathers of the boys I was friends with worked in a factory. There were two factories in the city that I grew up in, and the highest aspirations my male friends had was for a trade, electrician or carpenter or something like that. I knew no one that wanted to go to college. No one. And I got to college by an accident. In my memoir, I talk about how, abused children often become delinquents as adolescents. And I became a delinquent, and I was arrested for drunkenness and vandalism, and I was expelled from high school for a truancy scheme. And I was a bad boy and headed for a bad outcome. And I was sitting around after graduating from high school, looking at brochures of different branches of the service, figuring, well, I'll join the Marines. That'll be it. And a friend of mine, I was on the track team, and a friend of mine for the track team came over, and he wanted me to go with him to LA City College. It's a community college that serves Los Angeles. And I said, why? He said, well, it's college. I'm kind of nervous. It'd be good to have a buddy along. I said, sure. So we went, and I'm not going to sit there, for an hour while he's taking a test. So I took the test too and got in. And for the first time in my life, I was reinforced and encouraged for, academics. I turned out that I was actually liked math, trigonometry, and calculus, and I was really good at it. I took trigonometry and calculus 1 and calculus 2, and after 3 semesters at community college, I did well enough that I got accepted to Berkeley, which was at that time the flagship school of the University of California, and far away like one of the best universities in the world at that time. It's gone down since then. So I got to, I had a lucky break. I mean, had I kept on the course that I was on, I certainly wouldn't be talking to you, and I probably would be dead.
Jail or killed or something. I want to bring you back to the positive psychology, and what works a lot with the guys I work with is bring up this idea of an honor code, and sometimes citing organizations like the Marines, right, or like the Knights of the Round Table or the Samurai, right, where the Bible for some folks, right, where like there's this honor code of what it means to be a man, and having guys develop their own version of that. The one that I use and I use for my company is strength, courage, mastery, and honor. That's kind of the masculine values that we hope to instill in our clients. And you brought up courage as far as getting, awarded for courage for taking a test, which I think is big, right? I think mental and emotional courage is in some ways more important than physical courage these days. But I'm curious your thoughts on that, on instilling these kind of like a values-based psychology with men. ACT, famously does this as well. But finding ways that men can generate their own values versus having these anti-values that we were talking about a little bit earlier.
I don't have much experience working with men to encourage those values, but I do think values clarification is very important, and I think it has to occur much earlier.
Yeah.
I think it has to occur in middle school.
I agree.
So I'm going to show a book. I don't know if your audience will be able to see it.
Yeah. You should be able to see it. Yeah.
The Masculinity Workbook for Teens by Chris Regalos.
Okay. Yeah, we can see that. Yeah.
So this book, in middle school, I'm going way earlier than your clients, but I think, and this is where I think the intervention needs to occur.
Yeah.
Because in middle school, you have adolescence, you have, an interest in sexuality suddenly, and gender roles are intensified in middle school. And so boys get tons of pressure to conform to the outmoded version of masculinity. And this gives them an opportunity to ask themselves, well, I'm getting all this pressure, but what do I really believe? What are the values that are important to me? What are the values that I've learned from my parents or my siblings, my older siblings? And helps them anchor their sense of self in their own values rather than, acceding to the pressure to be tough and dominant and unemotional and all these things. So, I really want to start a lot earlier than your adult male clients. I've been talking to people in Akron here at in the mayor's office, actually, because we've got a gun violence problem here. I think most community. What community do you live in?
I'm outside of Denver. I'm in a small mountain town, so not as bad. But I was in Baltimore. I was born and raised near Baltimore, which has a giant.
You know about gun violence, right?
Yeah. A lot of East Coast cities, a lot of gun violence out there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just terrible, and and so I've been talking to them about introducing this book or this curriculum into the SEL, social and emotional learning classes in middle school for boys. Because I do think we have to interrupt this harsh socialization. You mentioned gun violence, and it's just gotten out of hand in this country. Let's just take one type of gun violence because there's a number of different categories, but mass shootings, probably the scariest form of gun violence. Yeah. And mass shootings are defined as 4 victims, not including the perpetrator and not necessarily resulting in death, but 4 people shot at least. Mass shootings, I just have to open up the slide. Can I open up a slide?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I love data. Yeah, like I imagine they're on the rise, but yeah, I'm curious what the actual stats are.
All of them. I can just go to...
And I think school shootings in particular are the terrifying ones, right? Of children shooting children. It's terrifying.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So mass shootings, this is from the Gun Violence Archive, which is www.gun Gun Violence Archive, alloneword.org, and mass shootings increased from 272 in 2014 to 656 in 2023.
God.
More than doubled.
Yeah, tripled almost. That's wild.
Yeah, almost tripled. So, it's a huge, huge problem. I did a study that was published in 2020. I was trying to answer a question that was posed to me, which is that most gun violence is committed by males. Depending, and if you go to the FBI stats, where the sex of the perpetrator is known, 90 is well over 90% and as high as 98%, depending on the specific crime, is committed by boys and men. Yet the vast majority of boys and men would never do that. So my question was, what characterizes a tiny minority of men who would do that? So in this study, it was a literature review. I went outside my comfort zone because, psychologists only read psych journals. Well, I read sociology, criminology, and cultural anthropology and social work journals. And I found the same thing across all of these social science disciplines, obviously using different terms and using different methods. Psychology typically uses quantitative methods, and the other disciplines typically use qualitative methods. But I found the same finding. Males who feel their masculinity has been threatened are the ones who are more likely to commit gun violence.
Yeah, let me pause you there, because that's a big statement. Can you talk about masculinity being threatened? Like what that means and what that feels like for these guys? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. So, again, introducing kind of a technical term, we call it discrepancy strain. And it means that the strain that a man feels from a discrepancy between his self-image and his ideal image, okay? And so a lot of men have ideal images of the ideal man, right? And if they don't meet that, they feel this discrepancy strain. And it can be studied naturalistically in surveys using scales. By the way, we cannot in the laboratory study violence directly. I mean, obviously, you can't create an experiment in which violence occurs. So we use
half the population shoots somebody and half doesn't. Yeah, you can't really do that. Yeah.
No, it was. But we use proxies. So one proxy is self-reports of past violence. Another one are scales that indicate aggression or hostility and things of that nature. Yeah. And yet a third is experiments. So on the scales thing, there are a number of studies that have shown that in two scales in particular, the masculine gender role stress scale and the gender role discrepancy strain scale are associated with indicators of violence, aggression, hostility, etc. Then there are experiments in which they're called precarious manhood studies. Have you heard about these?
I've not, no. Please educate us.
So basically, a typical psych experiment, I recruited 100 men. I randomly assigned them to an experimental control condition. The experimental group gets asked to complete a feminizing task, braiding the hair on a mannequin and putting in pink ribbons. Okay. The control group gets either a neutral or a masculine task. So here's a masculine task, braiding rope to make it stronger. Okay. After each group completes the task, they're given the choice to either sit quietly in a room or punch a punching bag. Yes. Which group do you think opts more often to punch the punching bag?
Yeah, the one that's braiding the doll's hair, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so this is to reestablish their masculinity. Yeah.
Threatening masculinity and opting for a proxy for violence. Okay? So And here's an even better example. Remington made the weapon that was used in the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre.
Yep.
It was an AR-15, which is a military assault rifle. And the parents and survivors won a $73 million settlement against Remington for the way they advertised the gun. And the slide I wanted to show you is one of the ads, and I'll describe it. It's a square with the weapon running diagonally across the page. And everybody knows what an AR-15 looks like. It has that curved barrel, like I'm not sure it's a barrel, a curved thing, and a long gun.
Yep.
And then in the bottom right-hand corner, it has the logo of the company, which interestingly enough is a serpent. And then in the bottom left-hand corner is a caption that says, "Your man card reissued."
That's it. I'm trying to pull it up so I can change what talking, but that's it. That's wild. I'm not familiar with that ad.
Did you pull it up? Did you find it? You were
Yes.
looking online for it?
I have it. Let me share it with the folks here. Yeah, right here. Consider your man card reissued.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Proof of your manhood. The man card from Bushmaster.
Yep.
Yep. So this is
So
that's wild. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I spoke to the attorney after that settlement, and he was amazed but happy, obviously.
Yeah.
But you see what I'm talking about here. So this again, this is the point I'm trying to make: is that men who feel their masculinity has been threatened are more likely to resort to violence, and including gun violence. So that's another reason why I want to emphasize the masculinity workbook in middle school, because I think if we can, insulate boys from the tremendous pressure they have to conform to masculine norms, maybe, their masculinity won't be so precious to them that they feel they have to murder people if somebody disses them.
Yeah, I hear you, and that's a big takeaway I'm taking from the show, because, and our listeners are probably having the same experience, because the media, right, it does talk about mental health, right, with these shooters, but they often say, oh, they're psychotic, right, they're bipolar, they have some clinical mental health diagnosis. But what I just want to reiterate you're saying is while that may be a subset, most of it is this masculinity threatening situation. Right. It's not that they are, clinically mental or they're, quote, crazy people. Right. It's they're normal guys, but they feel like their masculinity is being taken away, being threatened, and they have to lash out. I think that needs to be talked about way more. Right. Because like you said, there are interventions we can do at an earlier age to hopefully mitigate some of those feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the mental illness thing, there are a couple of facts often don't get stated, that people who are actually diagnosed with, serious mental illness commit violent crimes at a much lower frequency. And secondly, men and women
just to function, right? Like basic functioning is hard, let alone planning a mass shooting. People that have that level of clinical mental health, they're just trying to get by day after day. They're not psychopath murderers.
No, they're not. And the other thing that retort, which is often offered by legislators who oppose gun safety legislation, they say, well, it's mental illness. We need more mental health care. Well, mental illness, there are some differences between the sexes, but in terms of serious mental illness, I don't know of any differences between the sexes. So why aren't more women committing mass shootings? The mental illness argument evaporates when you give it just the slightest bit of scrutiny. No, it is about threatened masculinity. I would go so far as to say that threatened masculinity is a public health hazard.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
So you talk about those interventions, and I'll put the workbook in the show notes too. I'm curious what you think about this. What I was looking up actually earlier is, I'm sure you're familiar with Richard Reeves' work, where he talks about starting a HEAL program similar to the STEM program, right? So STEM, for our listeners, right, is kind of women getting into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? HEAL, as well as looking at, so I got it right, is getting men into health, education, administration, and literacy. So really kind of piggybacking off of the same exact structure that STEM programs have, but getting men into those more helping and healing professions. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's great, and I think it's fully consistent with what I was saying earlier about allowing boys to have emotions that are stereotypically described as feminine.
Right.
They are not feminine; they're human.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, but I just wanted to go back to a point about emotional expression, and crying. Did we talk about crying the last session?
Not to my knowledge, no. You can.
Okay. So crying, I mean, when I grew up, that was the worst thing a boy could do.
Right. You're screwed. If your friends see you cry once, you're done, right? I mean, that's your whole social life falls apart. Yeah.
And my father, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to really cry about. Mm-hmm. So it's a threat. But all humans have tear ducts. And we know that crying relieves sadness because it releases endorphins and oxytocin, which are bodily hormones that all humans have that relieve sadness. And then finally, in making my case for why boys should cry, do you know what the shortest sentence is in the New Testament Bible? Not our Bible, but the New Testament Bible.
No, what is it?
Jesus wept.
There you go. Yeah.
So this whole nonsense about shutting boys off from their emotions is what we have to attack, really. And boys are human beings, and they need, and this would, I don't know if you call it positive psychology or positive masculinity. It's just, I don't really think those terms help. I just think that we need to allow boys to be who they are. And as humans, they have emotions, and they have the ability to sympathize with someone, and they have the ability to take care of somebody who's hurt. And they have all these abilities. What we really have to do is stop discouraging them. They're natural. They will be there. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. We're going to the end of our program. I think it's a phenomenal place to end, and I agree with you, right? I mean, kind of my take on it is allowing men to be touched by the world and actually be alive and feel things. Like I said, I mentioned earlier, so many guys are dead out there. I know a big part of your work is helping guys become more alive, and, emotions are the gateway to feeling alive, And
yeah, exactly.
So I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was great to hear a ton about the history. It was really awesome to really spotlight your work and hear some stats and science that I wasn't familiar with. You're a great wealth of knowledge. So Dr. Levant, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you learned something here. Do all the social stuff, like, share, subscribe, send it out. Send it to a guy who needs some help feeling some emotions, who wants to get some resource to become more alive and to really start to, be there in the world, right? So you can check us out. We're at Men's Therapy Online everywhere on all the socials. Google us. We're on every single social media platform, on every single podcast platform. Check us out. Send us guys to work with. We're here to help. So again, that's menstherapy.online. And we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.